In the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, where whispers travel faster than footsteps on marble floors, Captain James Morrison had always believed that loyalty meant silence. For 12 years, he'd stood guard over Britain's most precious treasures. Not the crown jewels locked away in the tower, but the royal family themselves. He'd sworn an oath to protect them from threats both foreign and domestic, external and internal. But what happens when the greatest threat comes from within the very heart of the monarchy itself? What happens when a trusted guardian discovers that the enemy isn't lurking in the shadows beyond the palace gates, but sitting at the royal breakfast table each morning, wearing a tiara and a smile that could freeze blood? Princess Charlotte, at 19, possessed her grandmother's steely resolve and her father's unwavering sense of justice. She also carried a burden that no teenager should bear: the knowledge that someone she was supposed to call family had been systematically destroying everything her late great-grandmother had built. The same person who now sat beside her grandfather, whispering poison into the ears of a grieving king. Morrison had noticed the changes first in small things. The way certain staff members would suddenly find themselves reassigned to distant estates. How charitable donations that had flowed freely for decades were mysteriously redirected. The subtle shifts in protocol that favored one particular member of the royal family over all others. But it was Charlotte's haunted eyes during family gatherings that finally convinced him something was terribly, dangerously wrong. The princess had tried to speak to her father, then to her grandfather. Each time, her concerns were dismissed as youthful imagination or grief-induced paranoia. The adults around her smiled patronizingly and suggested she focus on her studies, her royal duties, anything except the growing evidence that Camilla, queen consort, was not the devoted wife and stepmother she appeared to be to the world. But Captain Morrison had been trained to notice details others missed. He'd spent years studying micro-expressions, body language, the tiny tells that separated truth from deception. And what he'd begun to see in the palace corridors filled him with a cold dread that no amount of royal protocol could contain. The truth, when it finally surfaced, would shake the British monarchy to its very foundations. It would force a decorated military man to choose between blind loyalty and moral courage. It would transform a young princess from sheltered royal to reluctant whistleblower. And it would prove that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who share your dinner table each night, wearing crowns and claiming to serve the same cause you die to protect. This is the story of what happens when duty collides with truth, when loyalty becomes complicity, and when silence stops being golden and starts being deadly. This is the story of how a royal guard and a teenage princess risked everything to expose a conspiracy that threatened to corrupt the crown from within. Because some secrets are too dangerous to keep, even in a palace built on keeping them. Captain James Morrison adjusted his ceremonial sword one final time before taking his position outside the blue drawing room. 23 years in the British Army, 12 of them protecting the royal family, and he still felt that familiar flutter of anticipation before each shift. Today marked exactly 3 years since Queen Elizabeth II passing, and the weight of that loss still pressed heavily on everyone within the palace walls. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the corridor's ornate carpet. Morrison had walked these halls thousands of times, but lately something felt different. The atmosphere had changed since King Charles III's coronation, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what exactly had shifted. "Captain Morrison," a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find Princess Charlotte approaching, her school bag slung over one shoulder. At 19, she carried herself with the poise expected of someone born into royalty, yet there was something in her expression that immediately put Morrison on alert. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't been sleeping well, and her usual bright smile was noticeably absent. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said, offering a respectful nod. "You're up early for a Saturday." Charlotte glanced around the corridor nervously before stepping closer. "Captain," Could I speak with you privately? It's rather important. Morrison's training kicked in immediately. In his experience, when members of the royal family requested private conversations with security personnel, it usually meant trouble. He'd handled everything from paparazzi stalkers to death threats, but something in Charlotte's demeanor suggested this was different. Of course, Your Highness. The Queen and room is empty at this hour. They walked in silence through the palace corridors, past portraits of long-dead monarchs whose painted eyes seemed to follow their movement. Morrison noticed how Charlotte kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she expected to be followed. Her nervous energy was infectious, and he found himself automatically scanning doorways and alcoves for potential threats. The Queen and room was one of the smaller reception rooms, furnished with antique chairs and a writing desk that had supposedly belonged to the room's namesake. Morrison closed the door behind them and waited as Charlotte moved to the window, staring out at the palace gardens where early morning joggers were beginning their routes through St. James's Park. "Captain, how long have you been protecting our family?" Charlotte asked without turning around. 12 years, Your Highness. Since just after your 8th birthday. Actually, so you knew my great-grandmother well. I had the honor of serving under her late majesty. Yes, she was extraordinary. Charlotte finally turned to face him, and Morrison was startled by the intensity in her eyes. This wasn't the carefree teenager he'd been protecting. This was someone who'd seen something that had fundamentally changed her. Do you think she would have approved of the changes being made in her name? Morrison chose his words carefully. Your Highness, I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to. The charitable funding redirections, the staff reassignments, the way certain family members seem to have unprecedented access to decision-making processes. Charlotte's voice grew stronger with each word. I've been paying attention, Captain. Maybe too much attention. A chill ran down Morrison's spine. He noticed the same things, filed them away in the part of his mind that cataloged anomalies and patterns. But hearing them voiced by Charlotte made them suddenly, undeniably real. Princess, these are complex administrative matters. Perhaps you should discuss your concerns with your father. I tried that. Charlotte's interruption was sharp, uncharacteristic. 3 weeks ago, he said I was imagining things, that grief can make us see conspiracies where none exist. But, Captain, I'm not imagining the documents I've seen. Documents? Charlotte opened her school bag and withdrew a manila folder, setting it on the antique writing desk. Last month, I was looking for my grandfather in his study. He wasn't there, but his computer was still open. I saw an email chain about the Royal Foundation's funding allocations. Morrison's mouth went dry. Your Highness, I don't think you should be 40 million pounds, Captain. 40 million that was supposed to go to veterans' housing programs, mental health initiatives, and educational scholarships. All of it redirected to a private consulting firm called Pemberton Associates. The name hit Morrison like a physical blow. He'd heard it whispered in certain corridors, always in connection with Camilla's private secretary and her expanding network of advisors. Pemberton Associates had appeared seemingly overnight after the coronation, landing lucrative contracts for organizational restructuring and efficiency optimization. Did you research this company? Morrison heard himself ask, though every protocol manual screamed that he should end this conversation immediately. I did. Charlotte's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It's owned by Marcus Pemberton, who happens to be Camilla's nephew. The same Marcus Pemberton who's been quietly acquiring properties throughout London using shell companies that trace back to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Morrison felt the familiar sensation of pieces clicking into place, the same mental process that had saved his life more than once during his military service. The staff reassignments Charlotte mentioned weren't random. They'd all been people with years of institutional knowledge, individuals who'd served under Elizabeth II and understood how things were supposed to work. Princess, these are very serious allegations. They're not allegations, Captain. They're facts. And there's more. Charlotte opened the folder, revealing printed emails, financial documents, and what appear to be property records. Morrison's trained eye immediately recognized the official letterheads and security classifications on several of the papers. The Duchy of Cornwall properties that were supposed to be converted into affordable housing sold to private developers for half their market value. The buyers? Shell companies connected to the same offshore networks. Charlotte's hands were shaking now, and the Crown Estate revenues that Parliament approved for infrastructure improvements, somehow 40% of that funding ended up financing private security firms that only seemed to have one client. Which client? Camilla. The single word hung in the air between them like an accusation. Morrison understood immediately why Charlotte looked so haunted. She'd stumbled onto what appeared to be a systematic scheme to siphon royal funds and assets into private hands, all orchestrated by someone with intimate access to the monarchy's highest levels of decision-making. Your Highness, if these documents are authentic, this represents a level of fraud that could destroy the monarchy from within. Charlotte's voice was steady now, resolved. That's exactly what I think is happening. But every time I try to raise concerns, I'm told I'm being emotional or that I don't understand the complexities of modern royal administration. Morrison moved to examine the documents more closely. His background in military intelligence hadn't prepared him for forensic accounting, but he could recognize patterns. The dates on the financial transfers clustered around key events. Immediately after the coronation, during parliamentary recesses when oversight was minimal, and always authorized through channels that bypass traditional royal financial protocols. Princess, how did you obtain these documents? Charlotte's expression darkened. That's where things get really interesting, Captain. I didn't steal them. They were given to me. By whom? Someone who's been watching the same patterns we've been discussing. Someone who's in a position to document these transactions, but can't risk speaking up directly without losing everything they've worked for. Morrison's mind raced through possibilities. A staff member with access to financial records. Someone in the royal household's administrative hierarchy. Possibly even someone within the government offices that oversaw royal finances. This person approached you directly? 2 weeks ago. Left an envelope in my private study at university with a note saying they knew I'd been asking questions. Inside was enough documentation to make it clear that what I'd observed was just the tip of the iceberg. A sound in the corridor outside made them both freeze. Footsteps, measured and purposeful, moving past the Queen and room. Morrison automatically moved toward the door, listening carefully until the sounds faded into the distance. Princess, you realize the implications of what you're telling me. I realize that someone I'm supposed to call family is systematically stealing from institutions my great-grandmother spent 70 years building. I realize that veterans aren't getting the housing they were promised because that money is buying luxury properties for people who already have more than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. Charlotte's voice carried a steel that reminded Morrison powerfully of Elizabeth II. And I realize that if I don't do something about it, no one else will. Morrison looked at the young woman standing before him and saw the future of the monarchy, not just because of her bloodline, but because of her unwavering sense of right and wrong. She discovered something terrible, and instead of looking away or rationalizing it, she decided to act. What exactly are you asking me to do, Your Highness? Charlotte closed the folder and met his eyes directly. I'm asking you to help me find out just how deep this goes. I'm asking you to use your security clearance and your contacts to verify what I've shown you. And then, Captain Morrison, I'm asking you to help me decide what we do about it. Morrison understood that he was standing at a crossroads. Down one path lay the comfortable certainty of following orders and maintaining the status quo. Down the other lay an investigation that could expose corruption at the highest levels of the British monarchy, potentially destroying reputations and careers, possibly including his own. But as he looked at Charlotte's determined face, he thought about the oath he'd taken 12 years ago. He'd sworn to protect the royal family from all threats, foreign and domestic. He'd never imagined that might include protecting them from each other. Your Highness, if we're going to do this, we need to be extremely careful. If your suspicions are correct, we're dealing with someone who has access to the highest levels of royal decision-making and significant financial resources. Someone like that won't hesitate to eliminate threats to their operation. Charlotte nodded solemnly. I understand the risks, Captain, but I also understand what happens if we do nothing. The monarchy my great-grandmother built, the trust the British people place in our family, the charitable work that helps millions of people, all of it gets corrupted from within until there's nothing left worth preserving. Morrison made his decision. Then, we proceed very carefully, Your Highness. We document everything, verify everything twice, and we trust no one except each other until we know exactly what we're dealing with. As they prepared to leave the Queen and room, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just committed themselves to a path that would change everything. But, looking at Charlotte's determined expression, he knew they had no choice. Some threats to the crown came from outside the palace walls. Others, apparently, came from within the royal breakfast room. The hunt for truth had begun. 3 days after his conversation with Princess Charlotte, Captain Morrison found himself staring at his computer screen at 2 in the morning, surrounded by coffee cups and printouts that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. What had started as discreet inquiries into Pemberton Associates had mushroomed into something far more complex and dangerous than either he or Charlotte had initially imagined. The breakthrough had come through an unexpected source. Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh from the Metropolitan Police's Economic Crime Unit had been investigating suspicious property transactions in central London when she noticed a pattern that involved several companies connected to royal contracts. Morrison had reached out to her through unofficial channels, presenting the information as part of a routine security review. You're looking at approximately £200 million over the past 18 months, Walsh had told him during their clandestine meeting in a Westminster coffee shop. Shell companies, offshore accounts, property flips that make no economic sense unless you understand they're not actually property investments. Were they then? Money laundering. Classic layering scheme. Take legitimate funds from one source, move them through multiple transactions and entities, then bring them back into the UK property market looking clean and unconnected to the original source. Morrison had felt his blood chill. And you think royal fund are being used as the original source? I think someone with access to very large amounts of clean money is using the British property market as their personal washing machine. The companies involved all trace back to the same law firm, the same accounting practice, and ultimately to the same beneficial ownership structure. Which leads where? Walsh had slid a photograph across the table. It showed Camilla leaving a London office building, but the image had been taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. That's Pemberton Associates headquarters. Your queen consort visited there 6 times in the past 4 months, always on days when major financial transfers were processed. Now, alone in his flat, Morrison was trying to process the implications of what Walsh had shared with him. If her analysis was correct, Camilla wasn't just redirecting charitable funds to benefit her nephew's consulting company. She was orchestrating a sophisticated financial scheme that used royal resources to generate private wealth while maintaining plausible deniability through layers of legitimate-looking transactions. His secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Charlotte. Need to meet tomorrow. Have new information. Usual place. Morrison deleted the message and leaned back in his chair. The usual place was a private chapel within Windsor Castle that was rarely used except for small family services. They'd established it as their meeting point after discovering that several areas of Buckingham Palace had enhanced surveillance equipment installed since the coronation. The next morning's drive to Windsor gave Morrison time to organize his thoughts. He'd spent years protecting the royal family from external threats, but this situation required a completely different skill set. He was essentially conducting a covert investigation into someone who lived within the very institution he'd sworn to protect. Every move had to be calculated to avoid detection while gathering evidence that could ultimately save the monarchy from internal corruption. Charlotte was already waiting when he arrived at the chapel, but she wasn't alone. A middle-aged woman in a conservative business suit stood beside her, holding a briefcase that immediately identified her as someone accustomed to handling sensitive documents. Captain Morrison, I'd like you to meet Amanda Fitzgerald, Charlotte said without preamble. She's a forensic accountant who specializes in royal finances. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon before he caught himself. Your Highness, we discussed the importance of operational security. Ms. Fitzgerald is the source who originally provided me with the documents, Charlotte said calmly. She's been documenting irregularities for months, waiting for someone with enough institutional authority to take action. Fitzgerald stepped forward, extending her hand. Captain, I understand your caution. I've been working within the royal household's financial administration for 8 years. What I've discovered over the past year represents the largest financial fraud in the monarchy's modern history. Morrison studied Fitzgerald carefully. Her credentials were impeccable. A senior position in the Keeper of the Privy Purse's office, security clearance to the highest levels, and access to financial records that even he couldn't obtain through official channels. But her decision to approach Charlotte directly suggested either extraordinary courage or a personal agenda that hadn't yet been revealed. Ms. Fitzgerald, what exactly have you discovered? Fitzgerald opened her briefcase and withdrew a series of folders, each labeled with dates and financial codes. The scheme began approximately 6 months after the coronation. Initial amounts were relatively small, redirected charitable donations, consulting fees that seemed reasonable given the scope of services provided. But the scale has expanded exponentially. She handed Morrison the first folder. These are the original Pemberton Associates contracts. On the surface, they appear to be legitimate organizational consulting services. Efficiency reviews, administrative streamlining, modernization initiatives. All perfectly reasonable for a monarchy adapting to new leadership. Morrison examined the contracts. They were professionally prepared, filled with business jargon that obscured the actual services being provided. But the payment schedules were significant. Monthly retainers in the hundreds of thousands, with performance bonuses that could easily exceed £1 million annually. What services are they actually providing? That's where things get interesting, Fitzgerald said, opening the second folder. I've been tracking the work product from these contracts. Meeting minutes, consultation reports, implementation timelines. In 18 months, Pemberton Associates has produced exactly 47 pages of documentation to justify over £50 million in payments. Charlotte moved closer to examine the documents. £50 million for 47 pages of reports. It gets worse, Fitzgerald continued. The reports themselves are largely recycled content from publicly available sources. Management theories copied from business schools, organizational charts that duplicate existing royal household structures, and recommendations that were never actually implemented. Morrison felt the familiar sensation of a complex puzzle clicking into place. So, the consulting contracts are essentially fraudulent. But where does the money actually go once Pemberton Associates receives it? That's what took months to uncover, Fitzgerald said, opening the third folder. The money moves through a network of subsidiary companies, investment funds, and property development firms. But the ultimate destination is a portfolio of luxury properties across London, Edinburgh, and various offshore locations. She handed Morrison a series of property deeds and transfer documents. Apartments in Belgravia, townhouses in Mayfair, a castle in Scotland, and what appears to be a private island in the Caribbean. All purchased through companies that trace back to beneficial ownership structures controlled by Camilla and her immediate family. Morrison studied the property records, recognizing several addresses as among London's most exclusive locations. The total value had to be approaching £500 million. And these purchases are being funded through royal resources, charitable donations that should have gone to legitimate causes, and what appears to be systematic skimming from various crown assets, Fitzgerald confirmed. But the most troubling discovery is how they're covering their tracks. She opened the final folder, revealing what appear to be personnel files and internal memos. Anyone who asks questions about financial irregularities finds themselves reassigned, demoted, or eliminated from the royal household entirely. 3 senior staff members have been forced into early retirement after raising concerns about accounting discrepancies. 2 others have had their security clearances revoked on fabricated grounds. Charlotte's face had grown pale as she examined the personnel files. These are all people who served my great-grandmother for decades. Loyal staff members who understood how things were supposed to work. Exactly. They were systematically removed and replaced with individuals who either lack the institutional knowledge to recognize irregularities or who are directly complicit in the scheme. Morrison set down the documents and looked directly at Fitzgerald. Ms. Fitzgerald, why are you risking your career to expose this? You could lose everything if your involvement becomes known. Fitzgerald's expression hardened. Captain, I took an oath when I joined the royal household. I swore to serve the crown and protect the financial interests of the British people through responsible stewardship of royal resources. Watching someone systematically loot institutions that have been built over centuries, that's not something I can ignore, regardless of the personal cost. And you believe Camilla is personally directing this operation? I believe someone with her level of access and authority would have to be intimately involved for a scheme of this complexity to function. The timing correlates perfectly with her assumption of significant influence over royal finances. The beneficiaries are her family members and associates, and the cover-up involves removing people who pose threats to the operation. Morrison walked to one of the chapel's windows, looking out at the grounds where tourists were already gathering for morning tours. In a few hours, thousands of visitors would walk through Windsor Castle, drawn by their faith in the institution the royal family represented. They trusted that their monarchs were guardians of British values, protectors of charitable causes, and responsible stewards of resources that ultimately belong to the people. What evidence do we need to prove criminal activity? Morrison asked. More than we currently have, Fitzgerald admitted. Financial irregularities and questionable contracts aren't enough to support criminal charges against someone at Camilla's level. We need direct evidence of intent to defraud, documentation showing her personal involvement in directing the scheme, or testimony from individuals who can verify her specific instructions. Charlotte spoke for the first time in several minutes. Then, we need to get that evidence. Morrison turned from the window. Princess, what you're suggesting is extremely dangerous. If we're right about the scope of this operation, we're dealing with someone who has significant resources and no qualms about destroying people who threaten her interests. I understand the risks, Captain, but consider the alternative. If we do nothing, this continues and expands until it hollows out the monarchy from within. The charitable work, the institutional support for veterans and disadvantaged communities, the trust that binds the British people to the crown, all of it gets corrupted into a personal enrichment scheme. Fitzgerald nodded in agreement. Princess Charlotte is right. This isn't just about financial fraud. It's about the fundamental legitimacy of the British monarchy. If the public discovers that royal resources have been systematically stolen while charitable programs were defunded, the institution itself could collapse. Morrison understood the stakes, but he also understood the operational challenges they faced. How do we gather additional evidence without exposing our investigation? I have an idea about that, Charlotte said quietly. There's a family dinner tomorrow night. Informal gathering, just close family and a few key advisors. Camilla will be there, along with several people who might be directly involved in the financial arrangements. Princess, you can't seriously be considering wearing a recording device to dinner. Charlotte's voice was steady, determined. I'm absolutely considering exactly that. Morrison looked at the young woman who had somehow transformed from a sheltered teenager into someone willing to risk everything for the truth. He thought about his oath to protect the royal family, but now he understood that protection might require exposing the threats that came from within. If we do this, he said finally, we do it professionally. No mistakes, no improvisation, and no unnecessary risks. Charlotte smiled, and for the first time since their investigation began, Morrison saw a flash of the confident young woman she was becoming. Then you're with us, Captain. Morrison looked around the chapel, where centuries of royals had come seeking guidance during their most difficult decisions. The weight of history pressed down on him, but so did the clarity of purpose that came from choosing the right path, regardless of its difficulty. "I'm with you, Your Highness. All the way." The investigation was about to enter its most dangerous phase. The recording device was smaller than Charlotte had expected, barely larger than a button, and designed to be virtually undetectable even under close scrutiny. Morrison had obtained it through contacts in military intelligence, equipment originally intended for deep cover operations where discovery meant certain death. The microphone is sensitive enough to pick up conversations from across a dinner table, Morrison explained as he helped Charlotte position the device beneath her evening gown's collar. "Battery life is 4 hours, more than enough for tonight's gathering. But, Princess, I need you to understand the legal implications of what we're doing." They were in Charlotte's private apartment at Buckingham Palace, 2 hours before the family dinner. Morrison had arrived through service corridors to avoid the enhanced surveillance systems that monitored main palace entrances. Even their preparation felt like a covert operation, which Morrison supposed it had become. Recording private conversations without consent is illegal in most circumstances, Charlotte said, demonstrating she'd done her research. But there are exceptions when the recordings document criminal activity or serve the public interest. Those exceptions typically require prior authorization from law enforcement or judicial oversight. Morrison replied, "We're operating in a legal gray area that could invalidate any evidence we obtain. Only if we're planning to use the recordings in criminal proceedings." "But, Captain, what if we discover information that prevents further crimes from being committed? What if we learn about plans that could damage the monarchy or harm other people?" Morrison understood her reasoning, but his military background made him acutely aware of how quickly covert operations could spiral beyond their original parameters. "Your Highness, once we start this recording, we lose control over how the information might be used. Are you prepared for that level of uncertainty?" Charlotte adjusted the device's positioning and met his eyes in the mirror. "I'm prepared to know the truth. Whatever comes after that, we'll face together." The family dinner was being held in the palace's smaller dining room, an intimate space that could accommodate perhaps 20 people comfortably. According to the guest list Morrison had reviewed, tonight's gathering would include King Charles, Camilla, Prince William, and Catherine, Harry via video call from California, and several close friends and advisors who've been part of the royal household for years. Morrison would be stationed outside the dining room, officially providing security, but positioned where he could monitor emergency frequencies and coordinate with palace security if the situation became dangerous. He'd also arranged for Detective Inspector Walsh to be on standby, ready to intervene if they discovered evidence of immediate threats to Charlotte's safety. "Remember, your goal is to guide the conversation toward financial matters without appearing suspicious." Morrison coached as Charlotte made final adjustments to her appearance. Ask about charitable funding, mention the veterans' housing programs, reference the Duchy of Cornwall developments. See how Camilla responds when these topics arise. And if she becomes suspicious, then you abort immediately. Make an excuse about feeling unwell and leave the dining room. I'll be monitoring through palace security channels. If you signal distress by mentioning your headache, I'll create a distraction that gives you an excuse to exit." Charlotte nodded, though Morrison could see the tension in her shoulders. She was about to walk into a room with someone who might have orchestrated the theft of hundreds of millions of pounds, someone who demonstrated a willingness to destroy careers and reputations to protect her interests. The courage required was extraordinary, especially for someone who'd grown up trusting the people she was now investigating. "Princess, are you absolutely certain you want to proceed?" Charlotte picked up her evening purse, inside which she'd concealed a backup recording device and a small emergency beacon that would alert Morrison if she found herself in immediate danger. "Captain, 3 days ago, Amanda Fitzgerald showed us documentation proving that money intended for homeless veterans has been diverted to buy luxury properties. If I have to sit through an uncomfortable dinner to stop that from continuing, it's a small price to pay." Morrison walked Charlotte to the dining room, maintaining the professional demeanor expected of her security detail, while internally preparing for every scenario he could imagine. As they approached the ornate double doors, he could hear conversation and laughter from inside, the familiar sounds of a family gathering that masked what might be one of the most important intelligence operations in recent royal history. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said formally as the palace staff prepared to announce her arrival. "Enjoy your evening." Charlotte gave him a subtle nod, then walked through the doors into a room that would either provide the evidence they needed or expose their investigation to someone who might destroy them for discovering the truth. Morrison took his position outside the dining room and activated his communication equipment. Detective Inspector Walsh's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Alpha Team in position. We have eyes on all external approaches to the palace. If you need immediate extraction, we're ready to move." "Copy that. Target is in the room." Beginning surveillance phase. Through the dining room's heavy doors, Morrison could hear the muffled sounds of conversation, but the recording device would be capturing much clearer audio. Charlotte would have to navigate carefully between appearing naturally curious about family business and probing for information that could expose criminal activity. 15 minutes into the dinner, Morrison's earpiece activated with a direct transmission from Charlotte's recording device. The technology allowed him to monitor conversations in real time while creating a permanent record for later analysis. "And the response to the Veterans Housing Initiative has been absolutely tremendous," King Charles was saying. "The public supports these programs because they understand we have an obligation to serve those who've served our country." "Of course, darling," Camilla's voice came through clearly. "Though I do think we need to be more strategic about how we allocate resources. Some of these programs have become quite expensive relative to the outcomes they produce." Morrison felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly the type of conversation they needed to capture. "What do you mean, expensive relative to outcomes?" Charlotte's voice carried just the right tone of innocent curiosity. "Well, take the housing developments in Manchester and Birmingham. We've invested millions in construction and support services, but the actual number of veterans housed is quite small. Perhaps those resources could be deployed more efficiently through private partnerships." Morrison made notes on his tablet. Camilla was essentially arguing for privatizing programs that were currently providing direct government support to veterans, potentially opening opportunities for private companies to profit from contracts that should be serving public interests. "Private partnerships like Pemberton Associates?" Charlotte asked, and Morrison felt his stomach drop. That was too direct, too obviously fishing for information. There was a long pause before Camilla responded. "Charlotte, how do you know about Pemberton Associates?" "I've been paying more attention to royal business lately," Charlotte replied smoothly. "I think it's important for my generation to understand how the monarchy operates financially." "That's commendable, dear, but these matters are quite complex. Perhaps we should discuss them privately sometime, when we have more time to explore the details properly." Morrison recognized the deflection technique. Camilla was simultaneously acknowledging that Charlotte had stumbled onto something significant while offering to discuss it in a setting where she could better control the conversation and assess how much Charlotte actually knew. The conversation moved to safer topics for the next hour, but Morrison noticed that Camilla's contributions became more guarded. She was clearly assessing whether Charlotte's questions represented genuine curiosity or something more threatening. Then, just as Morrison was beginning to think they wouldn't obtain additional useful information, the conversation took an unexpected turn. "Charles, we need to discuss the Crown estate revenues," Camilla said during a pause in the general conversation. "The Treasury is requesting detailed accounting for the infrastructure improvements we approved last quarter." "Is there a problem with the documentation?" Prince William asked. "Nothing we can't handle," Camilla replied quickly. "But Marcus has suggested we might want to restructure how we manage these large projects. More efficiency, better oversight, reduced bureaucratic interference." Morrison's hands flew across his tablet as he documented the exchange. Camilla was discussing restructuring Crown estate management with her nephew Marcus Pemberton, potentially giving him even greater access to royal finances. "What kind of restructuring?" Charlotte asked. "Primarily moving project management to specialized consulting firms that can handle complex transactions more efficiently than traditional government oversight processes." It would actually save money in the long run by reducing administrative costs. Morrison understood immediately what Camilla was proposing. By moving Crown Estate project management to private consulting firms, undoubtedly including Pemberton Associates, she could essentially eliminate government oversight of how royal funds were spent while creating additional opportunities for private profit. Would Parliament need to approve those changes? Charlotte pressed. Not necessarily, dear. Many of these arrangements can be structured as internal administrative improvements that fall within existing royal prerogatives. Morrison felt cold dread spreading through his chest. If Camilla succeeded in privatizing Crown Estate management, she could potentially gain control over assets worth billions of pounds with minimal external oversight. The scale of potential theft would dwarf what they'd already discovered. His earpiece crackled with Walsh's voice. Morrison, we're picking up encrypted communications from inside the palace. Someone is using military-grade communication equipment to coordinate with external parties. Morrison's training kicked in immediately. If Camilla had discovered their surveillance and was coordinating with outside security, Charlotte could be in immediate danger. Can you trace the source? Working on it, but the encryption is sophisticated. Professional grade, probably military or intelligence service level. Morrison made a decision. He activated his emergency communication to Charlotte through a subtle vibration pattern that indicated she should begin preparing to leave the dining room. But before he could implement extraction protocols, the dining room doors opened and a palace staff member approached him. Captain Morrison, Her Majesty requests your presence in the dining room. Morrison's blood turned to ice. Camilla had never requested his presence at a family dinner before. Either she discovered their surveillance, or she was testing to see how he responded to an unusual request. Of course. Did Her Majesty indicate the nature of the request? She mentioned wanting to discuss security arrangements for upcoming royal engagements. Morrison knew this was almost certainly a pretext, but refusing would be suspicious and might put Charlotte in greater danger. He had to walk into that dining room knowing that his investigation might have been compromised, that Charlotte might be exposed, and that their entire operation could be on the verge of catastrophic failure. As he approached the dining room doors, Morrison made peace with the possibility that the next few minutes would determine not only the success of their investigation, but potentially the safety of the young woman who trusted him to help her seek the truth about corruption at the heart of the British monarchy. The doors opened, and Morrison stepped into what might be either the climax of their investigation or the beginning of their destruction. Morrison entered the dining room to find all conversation had stopped. The family members and guests were looking at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern, but it was Camilla's face that made his blood run cold. Her smile was perfectly composed, but her eyes held a calculating intensity that reminded Morrison of predators he'd encountered during combat operations. Captain Morrison, thank you for joining us, Camilla said, her voice carrying the practiced warmth she'd perfected over years in the public eye. I was just telling the family about some security concerns that have come to my attention. King Charles looked puzzled. Security concerns? I haven't been briefed on any new threats. Nothing that requires your Majesty's immediate attention, Camilla replied smoothly. But I've received reports about potential surveillance activities targeting family members. I thought Captain Morrison might be able to provide some insights. Morrison felt the trap closing around him, but his military training had prepared him for situations where calm professionalism might be the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Your Majesty, could you be more specific about the nature of these reports? Of course. It appears someone has been conducting unauthorized financial investigations, accessing documents that should remain confidential, and potentially even recording private family conversations. The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison could see Charlotte's face from his peripheral vision, and her complexion had gone completely pale. Prince William was frowning, clearly trying to understand what was happening, while King Charles appeared genuinely confused. Recording conversations? Charles asked. Who would do such a thing? Camilla's gaze fixed directly on Charlotte. That's an excellent question, Charles. Perhaps someone who believes they've discovered irregularities that need to be documented? someone who might have access to private family spaces and the trust required to move freely through the palace. Morrison realized that Camilla knew everything. Somehow, she discovered their investigation, identified Charlotte as the source of the security breach, and was now orchestrating a public exposure that would discredit Charlotte while positioning herself as the victim of a surveillance operation. "Ma'am, I think there may be some misunderstanding," Morrison began, but Camilla raised her hand to stop him. "Actually, Captain, I think the situation is quite clear. 3 weeks ago, someone accessed the king's private computer without authorization. 2 weeks ago, classified financial documents were removed from my private secretary's office. And tonight, I've been informed that someone at this dinner table is wearing a recording device." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Morrison watched Charlotte's face and saw the moment she understood that their investigation had been discovered, their evidence potentially compromised, and their safety now seriously in question. But instead of crumbling under the pressure, Charlotte did something that surprised everyone in the room, including Morrison. She stood up slowly, reached into her evening gown, and removed the recording device, placing it on the table in front of her. "You're absolutely right, Camilla. I've been recording this conversation." The admission sent shock waves around the table. King Charles looked stunned, Prince William appeared angry, and several guests seemed ready to flee the room entirely. But Charlotte wasn't finished. "I've been recording because I discovered that someone has been systematically stealing money intended for veterans' housing, medical research, and educational programs. Someone with access to the highest levels of royal financial management has been redirecting millions of pounds to private companies owned by their family members." Camilla's composed facade cracked slightly. "Charlotte, you're obviously upset about something, but these accusations are completely unfounded." "Are they?" Charlotte opened her evening purse and withdrew a folder of documents. "Because I have bank records showing that Pemberton Associates has received over £50 million in consulting fees for services that were never actually provided. I have property deeds showing that money intended for affordable housing has been used to purchase luxury estates. And I have testimony from royal household staff members who were fired for asking questions about financial irregularities." Morrison watched the dynamics around the table shift dramatically. King Charles was now looking at Camilla with an expression of growing suspicion, while Prince William was studying the documents Charlotte had placed on the table. "Charles, surely you don't believe these accusations," Camilla said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. King Charles picked up one of the documents, examining it carefully. "These appear to be official financial records. Charlotte, where did you obtain these?" "From someone within the royal household who's been documenting fraud for months, waiting for someone with enough authority to take action." Morrison knew this was the moment when their investigation would either succeed or fail completely. If King Charles dismissed Charlotte's evidence or chose to protect Camilla regardless of the facts, they would lose any chance of stopping the financial scheme. But if he took the accusations seriously, they might finally have the institutional support needed to expose the full scope of the corruption. "Captain Morrison," King Charles said quietly, "what is your assessment of these allegations?" Morrison understood that his next words would determine not only his own future, but potentially the future of the British monarchy. He'd spent his career following orders and maintaining loyalty to the institution he served. Now he had to choose between institutional loyalty and moral integrity. "Your Majesty, based on my independent investigation, I believe Princess Charlotte's allegations are credible and supported by substantial evidence." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, but Morrison continued. "I've coordinated with Metropolitan Police financial crime investigators who have identified patterns consistent with sophisticated money laundering operations. The evidence suggests systematic diversion of royal funds to private entities controlled by individuals with intimate access to palace financial management." Camilla's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of expressing outrage or demanding to examine the evidence, she stood abruptly and moved toward the door. Charles, I don't have to listen to these ridiculous accusations from a teenager and a security guard who've obviously coordinated some kind of conspiracy against me. Sit down, Camilla. King Charles's voice carried an authority that Morrison had rarely heard from him. If there are questions about financial management, we're going to address them now, in front of everyone present. Camilla hesitated, clearly calculating whether compliance or defiance would better serve her interests. Finally, she returned to her seat, but her body language radiated barely controlled hostility. Prince William had been examining Charlotte's documents during the exchange. These property transactions, some of these addresses are properties I've seen in connection with charitable housing initiatives. If money intended for those programs has been diverted to private purchases, it has, Charlotte said firmly. £40 million that Parliament approved for veterans' housing has been funneled through shell companies to purchase luxury properties that are now owned by offshore entities controlled by Camilla's family. King Charles set down the documents and looked directly at his wife. Camilla, I need you to explain these transactions. I need you to account for every pound that's been redirected through these consulting arrangements. For several long seconds, Camilla said nothing. Morrison could see her mind working, probably calculating what she could admit to without exposing the full scope of her operation. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and defensive. Charles, the consulting arrangements were approved through proper channels. If there are questions about how those funds were ultimately used, those questions should be directed to the consulting firms, not to me personally. But the consulting firms are owned by your nephew, Charlotte interjected, and the beneficial ownership structures trace directly back to trusts controlled by your immediate family. Morrison watched Camilla's facade finally collapse completely. The warm, gracious public persona disappeared, replaced by someone who looked capable of the systematic fraud they'd uncovered. You self-righteous little girl, Camilla said with venom that shocked everyone at the table. You have no idea what it takes to maintain this institution in the modern world. The old ways of doing things, the inefficient bureaucracies, the endless government oversight, all of it prevents the monarchy from operating with the efficiency required to remain relevant. King Charles leaned back in his chair, and Morrison could see realization dawning on his face. So you admit that you've been circumventing government oversight of royal finances. I admit that I've been working to modernize financial management practices that haven't changed since your mother's time. The world has changed, Charles. The monarchy has to adapt or it dies. Prince William's voice was quiet but deadly serious. Adaptation doesn't include stealing money intended for homeless veterans. Those programs were inefficient. Camilla's composure was completely gone now. Millions of pounds spent on bureaucracy and administration with minimal actual results. Private management achieves the same outcomes at a fraction of the cost. Charlotte leaned forward across the table. What outcomes? Show us the veterans who've been housed through your private management systems. Show us the medical research that's been funded. Show us any evidence that your efficient management has helped anyone except your bank accounts. Camilla looked around the table and seemed to realize that she'd lost any possibility of controlling the narrative. Her family members were staring at her with expressions of disgust and betrayal. The guests looked deeply uncomfortable, probably calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from what was clearly becoming a major scandal. You want evidence? Camilla said, standing again. The evidence is that the monarchy is financially stronger than it's been in decades. The Crown Estate is generating record revenues. The royal household is operating more efficiently than ever. Results matter more than process. Morrison stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Camilla and the door. His security instincts were screaming that someone cornered with this much to lose might become dangerous in unpredictable ways. Your Majesty, Morrison said to King Charles, I recommend that we secure these documents as evidence and coordinate with law enforcement agencies that are prepared to conduct a formal investigation. King Charles nodded slowly, and Morrison could see the weight of kingship settling on his shoulders in a new way. Captain Morrison is correct. This matter requires proper investigation through appropriate channels. Camilla laughed bitterly. Appropriate channels? Charles, I am your wife. I am queen consort. You're going to destroy your own marriage, damage the monarchy's reputation, and create years of scandal because a teenager with too much time on her hands has convinced you that efficient financial management is somehow criminal. I'm going to fulfill my constitutional obligations as king, Charles replied. That includes ensuring that royal resources are used for their intended purposes and that the British people can trust their monarchs to act with integrity. Morrison activated his communication device and spoke quietly. Alpha Team, we need immediate backup for evidence preservation and personal security. We also need Detective Inspector Walsh and her forensic accounting team to respond to the palace immediately. As he coordinated the emergency response, Morrison looked at Charlotte and felt a surge of admiration for the young woman who'd risked everything to expose corruption that could have destroyed the monarchy from within. She demonstrated courage that would have impressed his military commanders, integrity that honored her great-grandmother's legacy, and leadership qualities that suggested the British monarchy might have a very bright future indeed. But their investigation was far from over. They'd exposed Camilla's involvement, but they still needed to identify all the participants in the financial scheme, recover the stolen funds, and determine how deeply the corruption had penetrated royal institutions. The real work was just beginning. 6 months after that explosive dinner, Captain Morrison stood in the witness box at the Old Bailey, facing a packed courtroom that included international media, representatives from Parliament, and members of the royal family who'd come to witness the conclusion of what had become the most significant royal scandal in modern British history. The investigation that had begun with Princess Charlotte's suspicions had ultimately uncovered a criminal network that stretched far beyond what any of them had initially imagined. Detective Inspector Walsh's forensic accounting team had traced over £400 million in diverted funds, involving not just Camilla and her nephew Marcus Pemberton, but a sophisticated network of offshore companies, corrupt government officials, and private security firms. Captain Morrison, the prosecutor continued, in your testimony, you've described discovering systematic fraud that operated at the highest levels of the British monarchy. Can you explain for the court how this criminal enterprise was able to function for so long without detection? Morrison looked across the courtroom to where Charlotte sat in the public gallery, wearing the same expression of determined composure that had carried her through months of depositions, parliamentary hearings, and media scrutiny that would have crushed most people twice her age. The scheme succeeded because it exploited the trust and institutional loyalty that are fundamental to how the monarchy operates, Morrison replied. Royal household staff are trained to follow established hierarchies and to assume that financial decisions made by senior family members serve legitimate institutional purposes. The criminals involved used that trust as a weapon against the very institution they were supposed to serve. The defense attorney, representing Camilla in what had become an internationally watched trial, stood to object. Your Honor, the witness is offering opinion rather than factual testimony. Overruled. The witness is describing his professional assessment based on extensive investigation and his expertise in royal security protocols. Morrison continued. The fraudulent consulting contracts, the property schemes, the personnel changes that eliminated potential whistleblowers, all of it was structured to appear like normal administrative evolution. Unless someone had access to comprehensive financial records and the expertise to analyze complex transactions across multiple jurisdictions, the criminal activity would have appeared to be legitimate business operations. What Morrison didn't say in court, but what everyone involved understood, was that the scheme would never have been exposed without Charlotte's courage and Amanda Fitzgerald's willingness to risk her career by documenting the financial irregularities. Both women had paid significant personal costs for their decision to pursue the truth. Charlotte had endured months of character assassination from Camilla's supporters, who portrayed her as a spoiled teenager seeking attention by attacking a beloved royal figure. The British tabloids had been particularly vicious, alternately describing her as mentally unstable or politically motivated. But Charlotte had never wavered in her testimony, never retreated from the evidence, and never apologized for exposing corruption that had stolen resources from veterans, medical research, and educational programs. Amanda Fitzgerald had lost her position in the royal household immediately after her cooperation with the investigation became public. Despite whistleblower protections, she'd been effectively blacklisted from government financial positions and had struggled to find employment that utilized her specialized expertise. The personal cost of her integrity had been enormous, but she'd never expressed regret about her decision to cooperate with the investigation. Captain Morrison, can you describe the scope of the financial losses that resulted from this criminal enterprise? Morrison consulted his notes, though the numbers had been burned into his memory through months of investigation. The forensic accounting analysis identified approximately £412 million in diverted funds over an 18-month period. This included charitable donations that never reached their intended recipients, government appropriations for royal infrastructure that were redirected to private development projects, and Crown estate revenues that should have been returned to the Treasury. And what was the impact on the specific programs that were supposed to benefit from these funds? Veterans housing programs were delayed by 3 years due to lack of funding. Medical research initiatives that had been approved by Parliament were canceled entirely. Educational scholarship programs that had operated for decades were suspended indefinitely. Morrison paused, allowing the impact of those numbers to register with the jury. Thousands of people who should have received support through these programs were directly harmed by the criminal activity we've described. The prosecutor moved to a new line of questioning. Captain, in your professional assessment, could this criminal enterprise have continued indefinitely if Princess Charlotte had not initiated the investigation? Morrison looked directly at Camilla, who sat at the defendant's table wearing an expression of bitter defiance. Throughout the trial, she maintained her innocence while simultaneously attacking the investigation as a politically motivated conspiracy designed to damage the monarchy. Her defense strategy had essentially been to argue that even if financial irregularities had occurred, they represented administrative mistakes rather than intentional criminal activity. Based on the sophistication of the money laundering operations and the systematic elimination of potential oversight, I believe the criminal enterprise would have continued to expand until it had fundamentally corrupted the financial integrity of the British monarchy. Can you elaborate on that assessment? The evidence shows that the criminals were planning to privatize management of Crown estate assets worth billions of pounds. If those plans had succeeded, they would have gained control over resources that belonged to the British people while eliminating virtually all government oversight of how those resources were used. The scale of potential theft would have been unprecedented in the history of the British monarchy. Morrison's testimony concluded after 3 days of detailed questions about evidence collection, investigative procedures, and the coordination between royal security and law enforcement agencies. As he left the witness box, he caught Charlotte's eye and saw her subtle nod of appreciation. The trial itself lasted 6 weeks and revealed details that shocked even seasoned observers of royal affairs. Marcus Pemberton had testified about receiving explicit instructions from Camilla regarding which government contracts to pursue and how to structure financial arrangements to avoid detection. Several offshore banking officials had described sophisticated money laundering operations that had processed hundreds of millions in royal funds. Former royal household staff members had testified about being threatened with legal action if they discussed financial irregularities they'd observed. But perhaps the most damaging testimony had come from Camilla's own private secretary, who'd kept detailed records of meetings where strategies for circumventing government oversight had been discussed explicitly. Under immunity agreements, she described conversations where Camilla had referred to Crown estate assets as her personal inheritance and had discussed plans to modernize royal finances in ways that would eliminate parliamentary oversight entirely. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one who'd followed the evidence presented during the trial. Guilty on all counts of fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to defraud the Crown, and abuse of public office. The judge's sentencing remarks were particularly scathing. The defendant held a position of extraordinary trust within British society, the judge said. The British people placed their faith in her to serve as a guardian of institutions that represent their highest values. Instead, she systematically betrayed that trust for personal financial gain. The damage to the monarchy's reputation and the harm to individuals who should have benefited from the programs she corrupted represents a level of betrayal that demands the most serious consequences available under law. Camilla was sentenced to 15 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution of £412 million, plus additional penalties and interest. Her co-conspirators, including Marcus Pemberton, received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years, depending on their level of involvement in the criminal enterprise. But the legal proceedings were only part of the story's conclusion. The real transformation had occurred within the royal family itself, particularly in how King Charles had responded to discovering that his wife had systematically betrayed everything he believed the monarchy represented. The divorce proceedings had been swift and decisive. Charles had acted with a determination that surprised many observers who'd seen him as indecisive throughout his life. He'd immediately revoked all of Camilla's royal titles and privileges, expelled her from all royal properties, and initiated legal proceedings to recover assets that had been purchased with stolen funds. More importantly, Charles had implemented comprehensive reforms designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. Independent oversight boards now monitored all royal financial activities. Government auditors had expanded access to Crown estate records. Parliamentary committees had been granted unprecedented authority to review charitable programs funded through royal resources. Princess Charlotte had emerged from the scandal as a transformed public figure. The teenager who'd begun the investigation had evolved into a confident young woman whose integrity and courage had earned international admiration. She testified before Parliament about the need for transparency in royal finances, had spoken at veterans organizations about the importance of protecting resources intended for public benefit, and had become a powerful advocate for accountability in public institutions. Morrison had been promoted to head of royal security, with expanded authority to investigate potential threats to the monarchy's institutional integrity. His military background and demonstrated willingness to prioritize truth over institutional loyalty had made him an ideal candidate to lead security reforms designed to prevent future corruption. But perhaps the most significant change had been in public perception of the monarchy itself. Rather than being damaged by the scandal, the royal family had emerged with enhanced credibility because they demonstrated a willingness to hold their own members accountable for criminal behavior. Charlotte's courage and King Charles's decisive response had proven that the monarchy could adapt and reform when faced with serious challenges to its integrity. Standing outside the Old Bailey after Camilla's sentencing, Morrison watched Charlotte speak to reporters about the importance of institutional accountability. She'd grown into exactly the kind of leader the monarchy needed for the 21st century. Someone who understood that true loyalty meant protecting institutions from corruption rather than protecting corrupt individuals from consequences. "Captain Morrison," Charlotte said as she concluded her press conference, "thank you for everything you did to make this possible." Morrison looked at the young woman who'd risked everything to seek the truth about corruption at the heart of her own family. "Your Highness, I think you have that backwards. Thank you for having the courage to start this investigation. Thank you for trusting that the truth was more important than preserving comfortable lies." As they walked away from the courthouse together, Morrison reflected on how the investigation had changed all of them. They'd begun by trying to protect the monarchy from external threats, only to discover that the most dangerous threats came from within. But by confronting those threats honestly and completely, they'd ultimately strengthened the institution they'd sworn to serve. The British monarchy would face other challenges in the years ahead, but it would face them with renewed integrity, enhanced transparency, and the knowledge that even its most privileged members were accountable to the values and principles that justified its existence. The truth, Morrison realized, had indeed set them free. All of them except those who'd chosen to betray the trust placed in them by the British people. For them, the truth had brought exactly the consequences they'd earned through their actions. Justice had been served, and The monarchy had survived its greatest internal threat in modern history. The future, Morrison believed, looked brighter than it had in years.